Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the launch of Creating Hope in Conflict's latest scoping study. This report takes a deep dive into misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech in humanitarian context. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Zainah Alsamman. I'm the Senior Manager and Portfolio Lead of Creating Hope in Conflict. And Creating Hope in Conflict is the flagship humanitarian innovation portfolio at Grand Challenges Canada. I'll just start with a couple of kind of early remarks, opening remarks, and just to say that Creating Hope in Conflict, a Humanitarian Grand Challenge, is a partnership with the U.S. Agency for International Development, the UK Forward Commonwealth and Development Office, the Government of Netherlands, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Global Affairs Canada, and Grand Challenges Canada. We fund and accelerate life-saving and life-improving innovations to assist the most vulnerable and hardest to reach populations impacted by humanitarian crises caused by conflict. So today's topic is an important one. The urgency to counter harmful misinformation in humanitarian settings has never been greater, given its rising prevalence and sophistication, as seen in recent conflicts such as Ukraine and the ongoing situation in Gaza. Earlier in 2020, the global COVID-19 pandemic also really underscored the ongoing and critical challenge of harmful misinformation and disinformation. And so in response, the Creating Hope in Conflict began intentionally soliciting for innovations that could contribute to learning in this space and tackle the growing problem of misinformation and disinformation in bold and innovative ways. Through our past investments, we have gained insights into what could work, what might not work, and identified opportunities for further investment. Now, as part of this learning journey, the scoping report that we are launching today was commissioned to capture and better conceptualize the multidimensional landscape of misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. The report offers some helpful guidance on critical barriers worth addressing to enhance our collective impact. And so, before we dive into today's conversation, I wanted to just do a couple of quick introductions so you know who you're going to hear from today. We're really honored to have a distinguished panel of experts join us today. So first, we're going to hear from Dr. Fawad Akbari, who's the Senior Director of Humanitarian Innovation at Grand Challenges Canada. And then afterwards, we're going to hear from Anahi Ayala Iacucci, who is an independent consultant and author of the scoping study that we're launching today. And she's going to provide a brief overview of the report. Anahi has extensive experience working in fragile and conflict settings and has been actively involved in research and initiatives to counter misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. Following that, we will transition to our panel discussion, where Fawad and Anahi will be joined by Helen, McElhinney, and Joelle, Rizk. Helen is the Executive Director at the CDAC Network, a global alliance of organizations working to ensure people can access safe, trustworthy information and communicate during crises. And Joelle is a Digital Threats Advisor at the International Committee of the Red Cross, one of the largest global humanitarian movements who ensure humanitarian protection and assistance for people affected by armed conflict and other violence. Now, time permitting, we'll also be using the Q&A function on Zoom, and so you can see it at the bottom of your screen. And so if the conversation is sparking any or inspiring any questions for you, please feel free to log your questions in the Q&A function, the Q&A window, and we will do our best to address them throughout the conversation. So let's dive into today's conversation. And first, I'd like to welcome Fawad Akbari from Grand Challenges Canada.
Thank you, Zainah. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar for the launch of the scoping study report for misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech in humanitarian settings. As many of us know, in the humanitarian context, combating harmful information is not just a communication challenge. It is a matter of saving lives, protecting dignity of people who are affected by conflict, but also the humanitarian workers, and about ensuring that essential support and humanitarian response reaches those who are in most need. As my colleague Zainah mentioned earlier, since its launch in 2018, our Creating Hope in Conflict, a humanitarian grant challenge portfolio, has sought to identify, fund, and support innovative solutions to many pressing humanitarian issues, including life-saving information portfolio of our work. Over the past 6 years, we've funded over 25 innovations in this area, and this work was expanded during COVID pandemic, and with an objective to address the harmful information outbreak that was equally dangerous to the life and safety of people globally. As I said, we have funded 25 projects. I can't name all of them, but just to give you some examples, the Centennial Projects, which is also known as Wiki Rumors, HALA system, which is an early warning system about airstrikes, and Murmurate, a tracking and an innovation that tracks and addresses COVID-19 misinformation through social media, or a few examples of these innovations that we've supported, all aimed at providing trustworthy information that communities can depend on for safety and resilience. And my colleagues will paste the link to these innovations in the chat. So we have seen how misinformation and disinformation, whether through rumors, targeted hate speech, or coordinated campaigns, can undercut these efforts, the humanitarian response efforts, fueling more mistrust, inciting violence, and creating complex situations to humanitarian response that puts the affected community and humanitarian workers at risk. In today's increasingly digital world, misinformation also poses a global challenge. It's not just an issue for the humanitarian context. Actually, every country, every context is affected by this phenomenon. And we know that it affects humanity in multiple levels that goes beyond the humanitarian context, as I said. So the weaponization of information, further enabled by the rapid spread of artificial intelligence, is now a common feature in any crisis, whether that's climate-related or human-made. And the current conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine are the latest examples of such harmful information that not only affected people in those regions, but also divided the world on issues related to those conflicts. So it was within this urgent context that we commissioned the scoping study. And thanks to Anahi for taking on this challenge and working with us on this. So the scoping study, for us, the aim when we commissioned it, the aim was to deepen our understanding of harmful landscape in conflict settings, assess the current strategies that are being used by other actors in the context, and also map out areas for future targeted action to counter misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech effectively through funding and supporting innovations, while also maintaining our adherence to humanitarian principles. I won't go into details of the report because Anahi will have a full-on presentation about it. But what I'd like to stress today here is that we're gathering here today not just to only launch a report, but hoping to foster a critical dialogue, a serious conversation among those who are on this webinar, innovators, policymakers, humanitarian actors, funders, and communities who are affected on this. As Zainah said, the report has a lot of useful information. It talks about the current state of the affairs, some findings, key recommendations for all kinds of stakeholders, and more importantly, there's a measurement impact measurement framework that could be adapted by any partners. And Joelle will talk about this later on. So this was also a collaboration with ICRC, and it was kind of this part of the work was inspired by the work that ICRC is currently doing. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the floor back to Zainah and the panel. But before I close, I would like to thank our partners at USAID Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, UK's Foreign Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Global Affairs Canada, for being a steadfast partner in our creating hope in conflict, but also for their contribution to this study. So thank you for being here today, and for your dedication to this work. And looking forward to a fruitful conversation today.
Thanks, Fawad. And now, next, I'd like to welcome Anahi Ayala Iacucci, who's going to walk us through the scoping study. She's the researcher that led this entire study, actually, and so a wealth of information. We're going to try and condense it in about 15 minutes. So Anahi, over to you. Mic is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much, Zainah, and thank you, Fawad. Both thank you for the opportunity also to do this study. Actually, I have learned a lot, and has been a great opportunity for me to actually dive into something that I've been working on, but that, it's always feels like as soon as you feel like you are grappling with it, something changes, and then you have to rethink about what you're doing. So we can go to the next slide. The objective of this work, just to kind of like summarize it, was this scoping analysis, which basically, as Fawad said, is basically a snapshot, right? Where are we? What is happening? Who's funding what? Who's doing what? What are the different challenges and gaps that are emerging when we look at responding to misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech in humanitarian conflict settings? The second part of it was really to look at impact. And I think that that's the part that personally I enjoyed the most, but it's also something that it's really important that we start focusing on. I think that in general, the humanitarian community has a tendency to have more anecdotal evidence on the impact of their work. We see when we are giving people food and shelter and protection, the outcome of it. When it comes to misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech, I think that we still don't know exactly what is the overall impact of what we do, the activities that we implement, and especially what is the impact on communities of misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech in this kind of context. And then the third part of the study, of course, was to look at specific recommendations, both in terms of funding, so recommendations specifically to funders that are interested in supporting this work more, but also recommendation on the overall direction of where this work is going and where we should be looking at. And we can go to the next slide. The methodology, and I'm just gonna go very briefly over it, is the classical methodology for desk reviews and kind of landscape analysis. We reviewed all of the documentation already available, reports, research. And in this case, I have to shout out at ICRC again, because the incredible work that they have done in the past years in terms of researching, producing reports, and producing content, and creating spaces to have these conversations about misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech in this context has been absolutely pivotal in being able to then actually produce this desk review. And then, of course, I've also spoke to a lot of the people involved at different levels in different organizations on responding to misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. And then we've also tried to involve more local NGOs and local communities into trying to understand what is their view of this phenomenon, how is this affecting them, what are the different ways in which they are trying to respond to this. We can go to the next slide. The first part of the scoping study, as I said, is this desk review. And I'm going to jump also to the next slide again with the main findings, where for me, the overall outcome of the desk review in terms of learning for us as a community has been that we have a lot of information out there about misinformation, about disinformation, and about hate speech. There are also different frameworks that have been developed. What we are missing, which I think is something that, again, ICRC is actually already responding to, is that we're missing one framework that allow us to look at this kind of phenomenon within the context of conflict. And that is really where the line is for me. There's a lot of content out there that it's related to misinformation in different contexts. Again, COVID was a fantastic, in a way, testing ground for a lot of this conversation about how do we address it, especially with internet, AI, all of this abundance of technology that allow more of this information to float around. So for me, this was kind of like one of the main outcome of that desk review, the understanding that what is missing now is a clear framework for this context. And the second thing that is also missing is a better kind of understanding of how we respond. We are spending a lot of time unpacking the issue, but I think that it's time now that we start very much moving towards the action, what needs to happen. We can move on to the next slide and also to the next one. The second part of the scoping, the landscape analysis, was really to look at what's happening. And so the first thing was to look at implementing actors. Who is doing what? What are the different organizations that are active in this landscape? What are larger organizations doing? What are the UN doing? What are smaller organizations or local organizations doing when it comes to respond to this phenomenon? And we can move to the next slide. The second other bucket that was looked at in the landscape analysis was donors, and really trying to understand, where is the money going, but also, is it going in the right places? And if not, what are the issues? What are the challenges? How can we make sure that if we agree that this is a phenomenon that we all need to respond to together because it's affecting everybody at different levels, how do we do that also within the context of fundings and within the context of where priorities are established? And we can move on to the next slide. The last part of what I want to focus on is the actual recommendations. Everything else, you can very much read it in the report, but I think that the recommendations for me are very much the meat and the real outcome of this study. So we can go to the next slide. The first bucket of recommendation is really about funding. And for me, there's two key important factors here to look at. One is, and I'm very grateful that Creating Hope in Conflict is really talking about this and thinking about this, is that we are missing a dedicated portfolio approach when it comes to misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. And I think that I'll be using kind of a reference to ICRC when I speak about the fact that this has to be a 360 response. This has to be a way in which we look at also the way in which we fund activities to respond to MDH in a way where there is very much a coordinated approach. And that's actually the second very big recommendation for me to donors in general, is that we need better coordination. We need better understanding of what are the major donor funding, how that funding then reaches the ground and the field and the activities, and how those activities then are kind of like intersecting with each other in order, again, to maintain this idea that it needs to be a coordinated approach. And I think that funders have a lot to do and to work on in terms of much better fora for coordination of this kind of activities. The second bucket of recommendation, and we can move to the next one, is really about recommendation on what needs to be funded, right? What are some of the things that we really need to think about when we are addressing the issue of, okay, I want to support organization into these responses. What is the best way that I can support them with? And I think that here, the kind of like what I find to be the most important part for me is that we are still approaching misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech responses from a very top-down approach. This is due to the fact that the phenomenon has come to us as humanitarian organizations from a reputational perspective, from a security operational perspective. I think that we are now understanding that because this is just one side of the phenomenon, we really need to think about the impact on communities. But specifically, we need to think about responses that are locally led, responses that come from the community and that empower the community to really address this issue. We have to continue to think about the fact that as humanitarian organizations working in conflict, we are not supposedly there to stay. So when we are speaking about such a phenomenon like MDH, that phenomenon will stay, even if we go away, even if the emergency will not maybe be there anymore, even if we don't have the mandate to respond. So when we are thinking about what are we investing into, for me, locally led solutions, locally led implemented activities needs to be the starting point. And then definitely on the other side, really looking at less of the tech and more of the, if you want, social and human part of misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. We're still very much approaching this as we did 10 years ago with SMS and mobile, which is that it was all about the technology, right? It was all about the tools. The reality, it is very often we're finding that it's about trust, it's about engagement, and it's about that connection with the broader ecosystem where misinformation and disinformation are, that allow us to actually invest into the right direction. And then we can go to the next slide. The third kind of bucket of recommendations that are contained in the report are really related to innovation. And I think that here, it's always hard to talk about innovation, at least for me, coming from the innovation side, because often we tend to equate innovation with technology. And we tend to think innovation means AI, high tech. And the reality is that in my experience, and I think it comes through also through the report, the best type of responses and the best type of ways to respond to some of this phenomenon is really about thinking differently, using a different mental approach that actually involves, again, thinking about an ecosystem, thinking about the role of the local communities and local responses, and really thinking about the different ways in which we collaborate and we create different ecosystems where we share information better, we collaborate better, and we work in more in more coordinated way. And here again, the use of measurement for impact, I think it's extremely important. We still don't have clarity about what is the impact on communities, what are the different rights or the different protection concerns that specifically are linked to misinformation and disinformation and hate speech and conflict. How do we detect them? How do we connect what is happening offline with what is happening online? So that, again, we go back to the coordinated approach. Here, it's a very fluid kind of ecosystem, especially for misinformation and disinformation. We see that it floats in between offline and online, and it mutually reinforces itself. We also need to look at it from that perspective. And I think that there's a lot that can be experimented with, but also looked at in terms of really innovating the way in which we think about this and linking it more to the actual impact of our operation and our activities, which I want to make clear, I know is very difficult because humanitarian organizations, again, as I said before, tend to work for shorter period of time, for shorter mandates, especially in conflict, technically. So there is something that needs to be said about how able are we to measure the impact of what we do within the context of misinformation and disinformation in conflict in the long term, if we are not staying for the long run. And then the fourth bucket of recommendations, and we can move to the next slide, is the one that is specifically related to understanding impact. And I feel like this is one of these things that I keep saying and I keep talking about it. And I think it's so important that we really start to think about clear, specific objectives for the activities that we do. If you were doing a monitoring program or a fact-checking program, what's the measure of success? When is it that you can say this project actually was worthwhile, the money that I invested, the time that I invested? And that also looks at it, investing more into research and understanding this phenomenon better. As I said, there's a lot of talking about this phenomenon and a lot of studies about aftermath studies, I think that we really start to look into specific ways in which we respond. How can this be piloted or tested? How can we look at what could work in different kind of contexts in a much more flexible way, you know, since that we've done at least until now. And then the last set of recommendations, and we can move to the last slide, is really about the prioritization of funding. And I think that, you know, it's always hard to say you shouldn't be funding something or you should be wary of funding certain things. I think that what we're looking at here is very much, let's try to shy away from investing a lot of activities and a lot of money and a lot of thinking into one single type of solutions, especially if there is no coordination. So working exclusively on fact-checking and monitoring without actually having systems that allow people to use that information to design responses and then implement those responses, it feels a little bit useful to itself. It's like talking to each other in a closed room. And the same thing happens when we focus exclusively on projects that aim at having certain type of information removed or deleted from the internet. Again, yes, we can do that. And yes, social media companies are willing to have conversation about removing content that can be potentially dangerous. But I think that we need to keep in mind that that is not the real core issue. The core issue is not that someone should be allowed to delete content that it's posted online. The real issue is that when some of this content is posted, people need to have the understanding, the trust, and the ability to verify that content and understand if it's something that they want to believe or not, or share, or, you know, send to other people. And I think that a lot of it is really, again, going back to that 360 overview of like all of the ecosystem in which misinformation and disinformation kind of work around. I think that that's kind of like the closing up for me. I think I've been good with my 15 minutes. One of the things that I definitely want to close with is absolutely a huge thank you to Joelle specifically, but also to Jacobo Quintanilla for the incredible work that they have done in the past years at ICRC on misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech, but also for the incredible amount of time that they've taken out of their jobs to support me in doing this research and to share, you know, all of the lessons learned and learning that they have done over the past years. I think it's, as you said, Fawad, this would have not been possible without all of the work that has been done on that side. So I'm very happy that this was also kind of a product of a very good collaboration, and actually shows that, you know, we all kind of understand we're all on the same boat in terms of really trying to figure out what is the best way to respond to this. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Anahi. And thank you for taking such a complex and meaty subject in general, condensing it into 100 and some page report, and then also summarizing it so beautifully and succinctly in 15 minutes. I appreciate that. Very important skill set. So thank you for that. Lots in there. And just a reminder, you know, there's a lot more in the report beyond some of those key bits. So please do check out the report that is now live on our website and have a look through it. I'm sure you'll find many things that are of interest to you in your respective domains of work. So thanks for that. Let's I wanted to now transition into our panel discussion, just to kind of unpack some of these topics a little bit more and really add some color to what you might read in the report also. And so I'm going to invite our panelists. I see Fawad's here, Anahi's here, Joelle, Helen is here. Hi, Helen, welcome. And so we've got everyone here up on stage. And maybe what we'll do for the benefit of those, I know some folks are accessing on mobile, and Zoom is not optimized very well for that currently. So maybe what we'll do is we'll take down the slideshow currently that's on. That way everyone can see our panelists nice and clear. And the slides and everything will be shared afterwards as well. So not to worry. And we're also recording this session. So if we could have our panelists front row and center on screen, that would be great. And while that's happening behind the scenes, thank you. Great. So let's dive into some of these questions. In the interest of time, I'm going to kind of pick on on individual speakers a little bit, just so we can stay on track. But good to see all your faces here on screen. So the first question that I have and this is really a question for everyone here on the panel. You're all sort of coming from different, I mean, all very much connected to the humanitarian sector, but sort of wearing slightly different hats in various different pockets of the sector. And so I was hoping all of you could speak to, the ways in which misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech affect people in humanitarian contexts. And by people, I mean both the local population, by humanitarian workers, humanitarian agencies. But I'd love to hear from all of you, kind of coming at from your different sort of organizational hats. If you could speak to a little bit of that and provide a little bit of illustration of like how misinformation actually manifests in this space. Who wants to go first?
I can do that.
Please do.
I mean, I can see, I can talk about, I think, the perspective that I see from the communities, because I think that there's a lot of other people here that can bring the other perspective. What we have observed in terms of the actual effect of misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech on communities in this kind of context is definitely they increase vulnerability in terms of what happens is that people are much less likely to recognize and understand what is the actual official information coming from humanitarian organizations or coming from agencies responding, because the environment in which they look at this information is now a lot bigger and a lot more confused. So one thing definitely is a much higher sense of insecurity and a much higher vulnerability when it comes to actually not being able to sort through this information and figure out what is the right one and what is not. The other one that is that we definitely see is the decrease in trust. So it becomes very difficult for people that are normally using the internet in this kind of situation to look for help, look for support, try to find what's the most important thing for them to do in that specific situation. It becomes then more difficult for them to understand, as I said before, what is the official information, what is not. We are seeing more attacks happening against humanitarian organizations, which specifically go to undermine that trust that these organizations have sometimes for years built with those communities. So those, I would say, are the two things that I see as quite big. And the third one, of course, is the decision-making issues, which is what kind of decisions people are making based on information that may not necessarily be the right information. And I think that this is where I think we have less information available about how that actually works. Are we assuming that people are making bad decisions over bad information? Is it actually happen? What is the magnitude of it? How much of an impact it has then on kind of like the future of that, right? One example was when I was working in Greece, misinformation about the border being open, the border from between Greece and Bulgaria and then Europe being open. And that, once led to hundreds of people leaving camps and leaving their accommodation in Athens to run to the border when it was very much a piece of misinformation that was circulating. So we see the effect of this when it comes to actually people making decisions about it.
Thanks for that, Anahi. Who wants to chime in next? Fawad, Joelle, Helen?
Yeah, I'm happy to go next and quickly share two more points. I think he covered the key points on how MDH undermines aid delivery and increases tension and violence and consequently vulnerability. So I won't go into those two areas, but I'd like to stress on the risk that it poses on humanitarian workers. We've seen this over and over in every context where misinformation, disinformation, or hate speech was used, that humanitarian workers were also affected because they need to be safe and protected to be able to deliver the humanitarian response. But if they're affected and they're targeted, then that actually undermines the whole purpose of humanitarian service delivery. For example, in 2023, 280 humanitarian workers were killed in the humanitarian context. This number was double the 2022. So it means that in the course of 1 year, the number has doubled. And a significant percentage of these 280 people who were killed were linked one way or other to some sort of spread of misinformation or disinformation. That's an example. And the second point I wanted to underscore, and he mentioned it, is trust. The misinformation disrupts trust within the community and between community and humanitarian workers. And as someone who lived in conflict myself, I can say that for me and for those who live in the humanitarian context, trust is perhaps the most important commodity available that once disrupted cannot be built easily because it takes time, it takes effort to build that trust. Well, trust building is a challenge everywhere, even in a relationship within the organization, but in a volatile context such as humanitarian context, it's even more challenging. So these are the additional 2 points I wanted to add.
Zainah, I'm happy to come in very much in support of the comments already been made. And good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to be here. My name's Helen McElhinney with the CDAC network. And we are indeed a network with lots of member organisations who are operating in different places around the world, and their operations vary from humanitarian actors to media development practitioners. And so just to build on the point of, yes, we really don't know how communities themselves, how their information environments have changed over a considerable period of time. But we know from our own experiences that we're living in a period of information disorder and things are more fragmented, and it is much more difficult to understand where people are getting their information and how much confidence they ascribe to which sources and why, and how that differs from one context to another. But we're all increasingly aware that this is an issue and that it runs alongside humanitarian emergencies. The sad reality is that often in conflict environments, we know propaganda has been with us for a long time, but there is also the disinformation and malign forces that are operating in those contexts in particular, which can have the very intended objective of undermining that fragile trust that Fawad mentioned. And I think there's maybe a bit more work being done on the sort of military side of the house about understanding the effectiveness of this and these dynamics than there has been on the humanitarian side thus far. So it'd be good to see some more attention to that. In terms of things that we haven't mentioned as well, the cost of doing business for everybody when you are a community and you're trying to figure out, like, who do you trust, and it takes you that much longer to figure out where do you get information, safe information. Your own personal costs can go up and increase as well as within the agencies. I was also really struck by, in our communities of practice, the conversations have come up about the scale of the security, the centrality of security of this. There was a conversation recently about Iraq where a whole bunch of people were like, we know how to deal with this, and this, but on this particular issue, we feel like this is our number one security issue. And it was quite striking. And they felt that the communities were saying the same thing, that they know how to navigate with militias and the fragile operating context, but they didn't know how to engage with and keep themselves safe in the environment of disinformation attacks, which I thought was very, very striking. Now, from the CDAC perspective, we've also heard quite a bit of stories from our media development practitioners over the years, because in a way, journalism and people who have been thinking about public interest journalism in fragility have been thinking about these dynamics a little bit longer and a little bit harder than humanitarians. And so they've also been bringing elements to do with what's happening from the civil society and the rights-based freedom of expression perspective into this. And I just wanted to land that at the outset to say that they've got a little bit more advanced in terms of tips and tricks and processes to bring to this? Over.
I guess that's my cue. Thank you, colleagues, for mentioning all of these very important points. I'll try to simply complement and to avoid repetition. Zainah, I think we could have done the entire webinar just on this question. There's a lot of ways in which harmful information, be it mis or disinformation or malinformation or hate speech or other forms as well, may impact people. And it's also good to acknowledge that it impacts different people with different vulnerabilities in different ways as well, that it's not across the board. And in a lot of areas affected by conflict, you will see the information that is sponsored or that is organized and that has a very specific information advantage to be achieved for actors behind it, but this is not entirely it. This is also mixing with misinformation that people themselves are also spreading for the lack of better knowledge or because these are their grievances and these are their opinions. So it becomes very complex very quickly. I want to take us back to the person. So let's all just imagine for a second that we are that individual or that family that is sitting in a situation where you are already navigating fear for the safety of your loved ones. And you are already navigating fire in a sense because you are in a situation of conflict where you are subjected to hostilities, whether it's direct fire, airstrikes, or other forms of hostilities. And on top of that, the information ecosystem in which all of these fears and conditions that you are navigating becomes also in itself a source of risk to your safety and to the safety of your family. And when it is not the case, it's also impacting when it's not just about physical safety, it's also about either your access to services or about decision making and your situational awareness, or also about your ability to believe and to discern what is risky, what is true, what is in line with your beliefs and what is not. In a way, your very brain as a human becomes an extension of that conflict environment, of that battlefield. And that is a very impactful situation for an individual that is already at risk to be in. It makes, like the colleague said, the ability to make decisions timely very complex and adds additional potential trauma, but also risk and stress on the people when they need to make decisions fast sometimes. But also it triggers a lot of, we've seen also in other situations that it triggers a lot of negative sentiments and escalation of violence. And we've seen that there is that environment in which information is circulating, and then there is a harm happening at the end. Can be targeted attacks, it can be escalation of anger and violence, it can be spontaneous violence. In between, there is always, almost always, with the exception of a few examples like doxing, for example, there is always a harmful act that is happening in between the information and the harm. And that harmful act is very much influenced by the entirety of the information ecosystem. So it's important to see harmful information and information narratives that spread in times of conflict as an extension of the conflict domain into the information space. And that is one of the reasons why we have invested so much work into a conflict-specific lens, whether because of the way we see the information space, or we can touch on that later, the responses to it. I want to maybe also add one point on the impact on humanitarian organizations. Again, my colleagues mentioned the issue of trust. I added the access to services, but there's also an additional point that I'd like to make and raise awareness on, and that is our duty of care towards our staff and volunteers, and the way that in which the harmful information is impacting them and their families directly for the very reason that they are humanitarian workers. We've seen how humanitarian principles were target of harmful information campaigns and harmful narratives. And then we've seen also how the images of humanitarian organizations have been also, and their mandates have been targeted as well by harmful narratives. And that not only creates a situation where the staff and the volunteers and people that are working in humanitarian organizations are questioning, but also creates a situation where they need to justify that to family and friends and communities. And it makes it a lot more, it puts them at risk on their way to the office, on their way to the project site, on their way to deliver a service. It is putting people at risk for the very fact that they are wearing the banner, for example, of neutrality, or for the very fact that they are supporting a community that is considered such or such by one or the other party of a conflict. Which again brings us back to when we are operating in a situation of conflict, the approach is not just about this is fake news, this is true, this is false. No, the approach is a lot more complex because of the specific dynamics in conflict settings. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Joelle, and thank you to our panelists for really illustrating the multidimensional elements of risk and how misinformation can impact affected populations and humanitarian workers, of course. I wanted to dive into the topic of AI. I know AI tools are, I mean, we all know AI is here to stay, and it's everywhere. It's sort of affecting all aspects of everybody's work these days. And I wanted to hear maybe from Helen and maybe Anahi, you know, there's ongoing debate in the sector. Is AI a threat to humanitarian work? Is it an opportunity? And I think in the context of misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech, what do you think will prove to be more consequential in the future? Is it the threat of AI fueling more misinformation, or is it its power to be used as a tool to counter or to combat misinformation, disinformation?
What a day to be asking that question. And it's a really important question, because this is going to change the future of our operating environment in crisis, but at home as well. And one thing we haven't talked about is the upstream narratives about conflict environments and about people in conflict that can really alter donors' space to move and to allocate resources as well. And I think some of that sort of dodges the question, Zainah. It's going to be both, right? And we don't want to set it up as a binary. Technology will, and it will offer incredible opportunities, and we're already seeing a huge acceleration in the use of AI-enabled social listening tools being rolled out across the UN agencies. As an aside, one plea from my side would be to see how we might get the access to the intelligence that's being generated by these big, expensive tools, making that available to communities themselves, or at the very least to locally led humanitarian actors who won't be able to afford to pay for those kind of capabilities. But there are great things coming on the market, and we absolutely need to explore and use what we can, where we can. But at the same time, this is not a static environment. We're seeing sort of a hyper-synthesized environment moving at speed, and new capabilities becoming more and more available to whomever would like to play with them in a lot of these contexts. And some of the latest stuff to do with audio to video creation and generative AI capabilities are kind of terrifying. And will lead us we're going to need to be fast and agile in how we respond, and work across the sector in solidarity with one another to keep people aware of what's coming on new. What do you need to worry about? What can you afford to deprioritize? Where do we need to focus our attention? And that will determine much about whether or not the AI-enabled capabilities help or hinder impacts and harms for communities. Over.
I mean, I think I agree with everything that Helen said. I think that for me, it's like I feel a bit of a deja vu. You know, if you were around 10 years ago, when, so remember 2010, when the Haiti earthquake happened, the humanitarian community discovered SMS and mobile phones. And it was a revolution in the way we were working. We started using SMS and mobile phones to track deliveries, to connect directly with people. Now every single humanitarian emergency where you go to has a call center or WhatsApp groups or whatever that is, right? So in the adoption and understanding of technology, the humanitarian community is historically extremely slow. We know, and I've seen in my experience that we go in phases. The first phase is absolute terror. It's like whatever technology is coming in, it's super dangerous. Nobody should use it. It's really bad. And then we start to calm down a little bit and explore it a little bit. And we start realizing what is helpful for and what is not helpful for. And we start discerning what are the uses of this type of technology that help and support our work and what are the ones that are not. In this context, what I've always seen is that communities are a lot faster. And by communities, I mean both communities in terms of the community we work with and the community we interact with, but also in terms of, call it the bad actors, call it the actors that are using these technologies with bad intentions. They are normally a lot faster, a lot more efficient, a lot better at understanding these technologies as soon as they come up and start using them. And I think that that again goes back into, you know, we need to go away from the binary. Is it good? Is it bad? We need to understand how this technology works. And we also need to look and listen a little bit more at what is happening at the field level and what communities are actually already doing and understanding and how they are using and understanding these technologies.
Thanks for that, Anahi and Helen. An excellent point, Helen, I think, about making these social listening, various technologies and the data that comes out of it available to local organizations and local communities. I think it's an excellent point. Fawad, you've been kind of quiet. Let's draw you into the conversation. I've got a question for you. Some of you know, Anahi at the beginning talked about the full scope of recommendations of the report, and what do you think are some of the barriers to implementing some of those, or the full scale of recommendations of this report? What are some of the challenges there?
Sure. I'm mindful of time, so I'll try to limit my response to a couple of points. Again, this could be an hour conversation in itself. I think for me, the most important, and this came out in the report as well, but also from our own experience, lack of coordination between various actors is really one of the key challenges in terms of ability of the sector as a whole to implement the full scale of recommendations that is in the report. And that applies to lack of coordination or insufficient coordination between technical actors as well as funders. There are various funding sources that fund innovation, fund MDH in the humanitarian context, but some approach it through technology, some through community aspects, some don't even call it in that way, but they contribute to it. So improving coordination is perhaps for me the most important aspect of it. And then increase in, well, as a challenge, limited funding and resources is the second issue. So the report also talks about this, that we have to find alternative ways, innovative ways of bringing resources, new resources to this area, because it is, as others mentioned earlier, it's a rapidly evolving aspect that affects humanitarian context and humanitarian workers. So this needs to be prioritized by funding and resources. And the third, perhaps most important issue is the complexity around this topic. And Joelle talked about that in full detail, so I won't repeat it. That complexity really is a barrier. And someone actually in the Q&A also mentions the role of government, but like that could apply to any party that they withhold information. Particularly, governments are expected to deliver useful information at a timely, in a timely manner to populations so they can make decisions. And at the time of COVID, for example, this information, the information was not delivered to people in some contexts, and that actually complicated the environment even more. So yeah, these are like the top three. If time allow, I can talk more about it.
Thanks for that, Fawad. So we're about 5 minutes away from the end. What I'll do is I've got two kind of burning questions that I wanted to pose before we wrap up. So the first one I think I'm gonna pick on Joelle and Helen a little bit here this time. I mean, you're both representing sort of different organizations and organizational memberships, alliances. And from that perspective, what do you think is the future of MDH work in the humanitarian space? And, you know, do you have any examples of like solutions or innovative approaches that you think are proving to be, you know, useful or effective at starting to chip away at this like really important issue? You know, where are we going?
I'll give it a head start, and I'm sure that you'll find a lot of complementarity between what I'll say and what the perspective of the community work that Helen is championing will also bring. The reality is that we are, no matter how much work we've put into this, and he sort of hinted at years of looking into this issue, we are still catching up. We are still learning, and this field is changing. You mentioned AI. But there's also different ways in which the behavior of communities is changing in the way that they are using, consuming information, and the way that they are themselves also spreading information. We see also a shift to a lot of private messaging rather than open and public accessible data on social media platforms. So we are constantly adapting to the way that this environment is adapting. So that is important to know. There's a lot of work that is being put on preparedness, on anticipation, on being sure to detect harmful narratives on time and be able to respond adequately as well in conflict settings. There's so much work being done on improving capabilities also through AI and for detection, but also for monitoring, for analysis, for even engagement with communities. You'll hear about a lot of that. But what I think is really important for us to consider moving forward as humanitarians is the resilience of people that are themselves affected and their ability themselves to discern, to basically inoculate communities and give them that agency and that power to actually discern and decide when the time comes. And that is not only through what we hear a lot of talk about through just digital literacy. This is not a literacy question alone. This is a risk awareness. This is an access to information issue. This is a realization that there is an information vacuum that needs to be filled by appropriate actors. This is really addressing the information space as an operational field rather than just thinking of, again, content that may be tagged as fake or tagged as fact or not. And within that, I see a lot of potential for digital rights organizations that are themselves local organizations, localized organizations, must I say, that are working on this as an information-related risks in the digital sphere rather than, again, a question of misinformation and disinformation standalone in an operational context affected by conflict. Thank you.
Yes, all of that. And I was very excited this year in June when the UN took on this really hard task of like conceptualizing information integrity for everybody. So we ended up with more people becoming aware of the wider information environment challenges. And now we need to, you know, rise to that challenge within the humanitarian sector. And ICRC have been the thought leaders in this respect to sort of share knowledge as rapidly as we can through the system about what we're talking about. And remember to keep going back to that community level. And it isn't our instinct, ironically. We don't do demand-led aid very well, despite all our assertions that we do. And we've come a long way in terms of accountability and listening to people and giving them more agency in emergencies, but we're not really there yet. So if I can leave with one thing that we know does build trust, it's actually human encounter and community engagement and speaking to people and listening to them.
Thanks for that, Helen and Joelle. We're at 10:30. I'm going to give 30 seconds just for, we're talking about the future. And, Fawad, as the Senior Director of Humanitarian Innovation at Grand Challenges Canada, I mean, innovation is all we ever really think about. That's kind of our bread and butter. Where are we going? What's the next step? What's the role of innovation in countering misinformation?
Well, give me 30 seconds, so I'll be quick. So for us, developing more effective and efficient ways of responding to this would be the priority. So in other words, solutions that keep up with the fast pace of evolution in this area is the key priority. And then linked to that is the stress that everyone made on the role of communities. So basically, working with local actors, with communities who are affected, to come up with those solutions, but also brings those solutions that are tested and proven elsewhere and localize them and to make them available to local communities. So that's the role that we can play as a humanitarian funding and support platform, and that's what we are going to focus from here onwards, in the light of the findings from this report, but also the collaboration that we have with our partners.
Thanks for that, Fawad. And thanks to all of our panelists here today, Fawad, Joelle, Anahi, and Helen, for joining us in today's conversation and really shedding some light on this really complex and multidimensional space. I also want to thank our attendees for joining the conversation today. We're a minute over, but thanks for sticking around. The link to the report is in the chat. You can find it on our website as well. It is now live. We've got some social content as well that's just been launched across multiple channels. So please do share and shout it from the rooftops. An excellent report that we're really excited to unpack in the next coming year and see where it takes us in the world of innovation as well, and in, finding great solutions out there that can really target some of these problems that our panelists have alluded to today. So thank you all for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day, if any is left of it. For those of you on the other side of the pond, and for those of you on my side of the pond, you can enjoy the remainder of your day. Take care.